Podcast 8, The Beatles. This podcast is going to read a little bit like a biography mixed in with important historical facts and also information concerning the music production of the Beatles. You'll want to open up a window of the Normandale Rock History YouTube channel so that you can find the audio examples I'll be detailing during the podcast. The Beatles came from Liverpool. This is a city that is located 35 miles to the west from Manchester and directly across the pond from Dublin, and notice that it's located about 200 miles north and west of London. This is actually pretty significant because Liverpool, historically speaking, for a very, very long time has been a shipping and receiving port. And this is significant because it's an industrial and very dense urban area. The band history began when John Lennon, who died in 1983, started the Quarrymen in 1957. Notice that he would be 17. He recruited bandmates from Quarrybank High School. John Lennon and his buddies took part in a clique known as the Teddy Boys. A teddy boy can be identified basically by how they appear. They wear black leather or black, and they slick back their hair. They essentially have the bad boy look. The Teddy Boys and Liverpudlians, as they're called, as well as the English, enjoyed a kind of music similar to rockabilly called skiffle, to which Lonnie Donegan is the king. He's the king of skiffle. And this music, as I said, is very similar to the music that was coming out of Sun Records, which has its roots in country and blues and gospel. After high school, John went to art school, and eventually he flunked out. But he maintained the band with Paul McCartney and George Harrison at the time. In 1958, they called the band the Quarrymen. And at this point, Stu Sutcliffe joins the band, and the name of the band begins to evolve. You'll notice here that there are 4 different band titles: The Piers with John, The Silver Beatles, Long John and the Silver Beatles, and then finally they just drop it all and just go with the Beatles. And it's important to note that if you haven't figured this out already, that Beatles is spelled improperly. It's spelled with musical term beat, as it's called, because of the fact that they played a kind of music that is known as mercy beat music in Liverpool. Mercy beat music is pretty much the same way that we think of rock and roll, where we have a backbeat to it. Beat 2 and beat 4 of a bar are accentuated instead of the typical strong beat that you get in traditional concert music. In 1960, Pete Best joins the band. He's a drummer, and he was the drummer that lasted through the notoriously famous Hamburg bookings at the Indra and the Kaiserkeller. These clubs were located in a place in Hamburg that was considered to be a red light district. Now, because of the historic nature of the Beatles' history, these two places are now they're now museum-like in the way that they are treated. And this is where Stu met his girlfriend Astrid Kirchberg. Astrid was responsible for changing their appearance and their styles and bringing them from a teddy boy look to a more clean-cut look. And they figured that they'd probably get more bookings this way. And as a result, this image that Astrid brought to the Beatles had a lot to do with the reason why they were so safe in American mainstream. Stu drops out of the band in 1961, and they return to what's known as the Cavern Club, which is a club in Liverpool where they end up with a house gig. And in 1962, this is significant, they meet manager Brian Epstein. And through Brian, eventually they get a deal with Parlophone Records where they meet producer George Martin, who will stay with them for the majority of the band's very short 10-year career. Ringo Starr, whose real name is Richard Starkey, goes by Ringo Starr, replaced Pete Best because Pete Best could not play the drums adequately enough to do the kind of recording that George Martin was expecting from the band. You'll notice that the title of the slide is First Period. This is because I've divided up the creative efforts of the Beatles into 3 periods, determined by the kind of music that they were recording at the time. Now, in 1962, with Brian Epstein as manager and with George Martin as producer, they began to record their famous works. And this is where I define the demarcation point of where this band begins to change history in terms of the recorded music and the live performances that they gave. 1963 is a significant year in the history of the Beatles. Look at these hit recordings that they laid down at Parlophone. Love Me Do, P.S. I Love You, I Saw Her Standing There, Do You Want to Know a Secret, and Twist and Shout. This is also the year that Brian Epstein went to New York City after he got up the guts to go and see if he couldn't score a tour in America for his new band. Brian Epstein's 1963 trip to New York City proved to be fruitful in that he was able to book Carnegie Hall for a concert and score a deal with the producers of the Ed Sullivan Show for an appearance on the show. And in order to facilitate the tour and get it started, Capitol Records released I Want to Hold Your Hand in the United States, and went right to number 1 on the charts. First period songs have the following traits. They really are rock and roll songs. They have 12-bar blues patterns, they have backbeat, they have the rhythm section, they have backup vocals, and all of this is right intact. And one of the things about this is that through the constant rehearsal and the long stands at the Indra, at the Kaiserkeller, and then at the Cavern Club, they really honed down their ability to perform well together. And this is absolutely key to the Beatles' first period and the success. Because they were a tight band, because they were performing, giving quality performances of music that was really well rehearsed, they were able to take this kind of brand of rock and roll to a new level. It was like something no one had ever heard music quite like this before. It was very original and very well put together. To add to that, it's important to note that these performers, although they had somewhat long hair, much to the dismay of many parents, they weren't rhythm and blues musicians. They saw their skin color as being significant to the safety of the music itself, which is really probably very strange to think about and to hear, but it's true. The Beatles' success is possible because of the fact that they had excellent band management, a solid producer, and as a result they were able to sell out shows in stadiums and produce a career of international success. This is the first band in rock and roll history that has been able to accomplish this. But it's not because the band was able to do it on their own. They needed to have this support network of the industry. So here we have a creative band, right? And then we have the support of the industry finally taking the musicians to stardom. That's a point that can't be underestimated. And this is something that we need to remember when we think about the Beatles, is that they couldn't have gotten it done on their own. This first period is also the age of the album, the LP as they're called in the United States. The album allows for the collection of many songs. Now, rock and roll records in the 50s, the decade of the 50s, were issued on 45 discs. That means you can only have 2 songs on a record. That's why those songs are only 2 to 3 minutes, because that's all that a record allows for. But now, with an LP, we can have a 33.5 RPM LP loaded up with many songs, and you can have a variety of lengths of songs. And so we're going to see the development of that. However, in the Beatles' first period, we want to note that their tunes resembled singles in that they were 2 to 3 minute songs. But look at this list of albums released in the United States. Meet the Beatles, Hard Day's Night, and Help. These are the albums we constitute as being exemplary of what the first period Beatles music is. The Beatles' second period I identify as the experimentation period. And here, in this period, the Beatles are going to begin to experiment with recording, with the use of different instruments, with use of psychedelic drugs, and their lyrics are going to radically change from the love song type to a more profound type of lyric that is found in the United States in folk rock. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. Before we go on, notice the dates here, 1965 and 66. If you remember that Dylan's folk rock period began in the same year. And it's important to note that the Beatles met Bob Dylan in New York, and Dylan just berated them when it came to their lyrics. Like he gave them the impression that this age of the teeny bopper, teen idol type of rock and roll tune is over, and music needs to take a direction of importance. And that radically changed John Lennon's approach to the writing of lyrics. And this is where the band begins to take a dramatic change in terms of the way that they approach their lyrics. When we compare between John Lennon and Paul McCartney, the two primary lyric writers of the 1965 and 66 experimentation period, we notice that John's songs tend to resemble Dylan's in that they tend to be scathing social commentaries loaded with the pronoun I, and John's songs tend to be much more gentle. The album Rubber Soul is the first album that features these kinds of traits, and if you look at the album cover that I have on the slide here, you'll notice that the Beatles are looking down on us. That is a significant choice when you think of the artistic perspective of that they're looking, down on us. You'll notice they also have a much more serious countenance. And you'll also notice that Ringo, Paul, and George Harrison are looking away, whereas John Lennon is staring directly at us with his head almost in the center of the album. And then we have the Rubber Soul, the title, in bubble letters up on top. We also begin the period of album art, and the Beatles were in their marketing strategy utilized album art as a way to create even more depth of character for the band. Our next album is called Revolver, and here, if we look at the album cover once again, very similar principle. One of the Beatles is looking straight at us, and the others are looking away with very aloof expressions. And fed within this, a lot of study has been done when it comes to this album cover, but are pictures of famous people. August 29 of 1966 was the last concert the Beatles ever performed together. That's a little bit of a misnomer, but this date is very important to remember because in San Francisco, they decided to end this concert touring. And it's not surprising to me because the concert tour was very difficult for this band because anywhere they went, they were so famous that they would be swamped with paparazzi and with fans. And they basically had to, when they were on tour, lock themselves in their hotel room because if they went anywhere, they would just have these issues, and it was dangerous even to a certain degree in the craze, the crazy fans that would be surrounding them and chasing after them. Let's start with Eleanor Rigby, which is the second song on the first side of Revolver. And this is a song by Paul McCartney, and it's significant in rock history because of the fact that the accompaniment is entirely string octet. So this means violins, cellos, violas, etc. And this accompaniment was not set by the Beatles, but rather by somebody on the production team. And so here you have the concept of the song is created by the band or written by one of the band members, and then in recording and in production, they actually create this. Now, you have to ask yourself, is this mainstream pop because of the instrumentation, or is this rock and roll, or is it somewhere in between? But the one thing we probably can all agree on is that the lyric content is definitely a societal reflection of what Paul McCartney is seeing around him, which is something that Bob Dylan really started. But at the same time, it's definitely not the kind of lyric you would have in mainstream pop. So here is almost this hybrid genre where we have elements of many kinds of music coming together. And many people fail to really look and listen to the lyrics of this song. And when you do, it's absolutely what seems like a very aloof depiction of the content. It is actually very sad at the same time. And it's that kind of aloof response to a very serious subject matter. And this is the essence of British humor as well. It's almost very dry at the same time. So there's a lot of things coming together in this song. And but when you listen to it, really try to pick up on the lyrics and what is this song really about? Our next example is Yellow Submarine by Ringo Starr. In this example, the lyrics are just absolutely absurd and almost meaningless when it comes to reality. And although the Beatles would deny it, this almost sounds like it's describing a drug trip. However, it's worth noting that children really enjoy this song because the Yellow Submarine is like the school bus, and if they've seen the cartoon The Yellow Submarine, that has its cuteness factor as well. But it's important to note here that there's a lot of sound effects mixed in, and this is possible because of what they're able to do in the recording studio. Let's turn the album over now and listen to track 1 on side 2, which is Good Day Sunshine by Paul McCartney. This is an absolutely brilliant rock and roll tune, and it has all the elements of rock and roll, but also has this positive reflection that Paul McCartney tends to bring to his songs. I'd like to point out a couple of specific traits about this song. It'll help you maybe hear some of the differences between McCartney and Lennon's writing. This tune features a steady piano chord, and that really keeps the beat. And this is something that Paul McCartney does in a lot of his music. And you'll also notice that the intro to the song, which functions sort of as a chorus, it has no backbeat. Rather, the snare drum is hitting on every beat and accentuating every beat. But then in the lyric, the Ringo Starr changes the way he plays the drum, and he switches to the rock and roll backbeat. Next, let's listen to our first psychedelic song called Tomorrow Never Knows. This is a tune by John Lennon as well. And the lyrics are taken from a book called The Psychedelic Experience, a manual based on the Tibetan Book of the Dead by Timothy Leary, who was an avid supporter of the use of LSD in doing psychological testing. And we also know that many people at this point in the 1960s were taking LSD for recreational use as well. The lines go, when in doubt, relax, turn off your mind, and float downstream. And so, with that being the basis of the tune, I think we can make the direct connection between the LSD experience and the song itself. However, the song itself is very interesting, even without that regard. When you listen to this, it's almost overwhelming how much is really going on. There are sound tape effects that are looped together. There is a new instrument, the sitar, which is an Indian instrument that we'll talk a little bit more about that later. And this song is next to impossible in 1966 to replicate live because of the fact that there are so many sound effects that are being used that are created electronically. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later at the end. In 1967, the Beatles took a turn to the third period. This is the period I called the revolutionary period. 1967, Rolling Stone identifies their first record, the number one record of all time, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. In 1967, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band was a masterwork of recording engineering. The work took 129 days to record, beginning about December of 1966. The Beatles employed an entire orchestra, many types of keyboard instruments, the sitar, and guitars. They also included recording effects that they had learned from recording Revolver. For instance, multi-track recording and multi-voice tracking. Simply put, multi-track recording, you have many different inputs into a mixer, and you can record 4 tapes simultaneously, if we can just keep that simple imagery going. Then what you can do is you can take those 4 recordings and you can play those recordings and then mix them down into one track. And so by layering up these multi-track recordings, the possibilities are practically endless to the 1960s rock musician. Multi-voice tracking is another technique that you'll hear on this album. That's where you'll have the voice part sung and re-recorded a number of times and mixed down until the desired effect is achieved. The album itself was non-banded in its original release, and that is to say that the songs weren't separated by time or silence. Rather, they had elaborate transitions, and they simply ran together to make one continuous album, with the only real event is having to flip it over to listen to the other side. I like to identify this album as a loosely connected concept album. What I mean by that, a concept album will have a storyline that runs through it consistently. There will be melodies and themes that are used and recycled over and over again. In this album, there's one evidence of that, the Sgt. Pepper reprise. This is just before the final song of the album. The first tune comes back, but it's different, and you can listen to that if you find the album and locate those tracks. You'll hear what I'm talking about. Because of the numerous musicians and personnel required, they had to bring in studio musicians to play a lot of the other parts. And so this is very important. But so here, conceptually, the Beatles have the work planned, but once again, it requires that support network of the music industry to actually carry this out. Paul McCartney said, "We were fed up with being Beatles. We were not boys. We were men, artists, not performers." That's a very interesting statement, that he claims that they're artists, because an artist takes medium and creates a work, and then that work stands on its own. And we loosely use this term artist sometimes to describe performers. And while it makes sense that performance is an art in and of itself, the context of the word artist and the way Paul McCartney is using it here is more attuned to what Andy Warhol was doing, for instance, in the 1960s, or Michelangelo was doing in the Renaissance. This next slide, the quote from George Martin, corroborates what I was trying to get across by the previous quotes. You can see here that George Martin says they were building sound pictures. And in this slide, this quote corroborates the notion that Sgt. Pepper was a multi-member effort, and that it wasn't just the impetus of one person, like Pet Sounds, for instance, was for the Beach Boys, with Brian Wilson being the creative impetus behind the work. Rather, this is a joint effort. Let's listen to some tracks off Sgt. Pepper. Let's check out first the Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, the first track, and then look for Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, and then listen to the very last track on the album, which is called A Day in the Life. I'm going to take you through A Day in the Life and explain this song in a certain amount of detail. It's a very important song, and it has a lot of features that are key traits to the revolutionary period in the Beatles' history. In general, the song is 5 minutes and 7 seconds in length, which is really quite long for any rock and roll song. Songs that are longer than 2 to 3, 4 minutes rarely get radio play, even today. The personnel, the players required to perform the song include a rock band, orchestra, and somebody needs to be prepared to operate an alarm clock. The song itself took 35 hours to record, and compare that to Please Please Me, one of their first albums, which the entire album took 10 hours. So that's 3 times and then some the amount of time it took just to record one song. That's an important measure to understanding the perfection that the Beatles were attempting to put into their work. What's quite extraordinary about this song is its form. I have the form laid out here as a diagram. It has an A section, which consists of a verse, a bridge, which connects the verse to a B section, which is the second verse, and then finally we have another bridge, which connects the B section to another A section, which is slightly different than the first A section. And then finally we have what's called an outro, or an ending. Sometimes we'll call outro coda, but in pop songs we call it an outro, and that's just the end of the song and how it winds down. The first A section consists of the first verse, which depicts a car accident in which Tara Brown was killed driving what I believe was a Lotus Elan. Tara Brown was a friend to the Beatles, and also the heir to the Guinness brewing fortune. Key points to listen for: John Lennon's lead vocals and acoustic guitar playing. Listen very carefully to how John Lennon has a very aloof kind of quality in the way that he sings. He almost sounds completely removed from this horrific scene, and it's almost ironic in the way that he delivers and sings the lyrics. Listen for George Harrison's auxiliary percussion. Remember that term from Crash Course. He plays the maracas and just kind of shaking back and forth the maracas, which are a gourd, whereas when it's dried, the seeds inside then become a musical instrument. You can shake them back and forth and they keep a steady beat that way. Paul McCartney is on the piano here, and very typical of Paul McCartney's piano playing. Very much a rhythmic and chord instrument, very rhythm section oriented. And this is some fantastic drum playing by Ringo Starr. You're going to notice that he brings his drum fills in and out. Let me explain that. A drummer will typically keep regular time with backbeat rhythm, but occasionally at the end of a verse, they'll play a fill, which is the fill comes from the word filigree, which is frilly and foo-foo and ornate and curly fabric and buttons and bling and gold and this kind of stuff. Filigree. And it's just a decorative, improvised passage that will sometimes connect a verse to another verse or will introduce a chorus. And we're going to see this more later as well. But listen to how his drum playing complements the lyrics and how the ends of the lyrics and the drums are dovetailed together, and it's absolutely beautifully done. Also listen for the key lyric, "I'd love to turn you on." This lyric got the song banned on BBC Radio. That's British Broadcasting System radio. That's the public broadcasting system that is so popular in England and around the world for delivering up-to-the-minute news. This phrase comes from Timothy Leary expression. If you'll remember, Timothy Leary was the outspoken advocate for drug use, specifically lysergic acid diethylamide, LSD, in the 1960s. His phrase, turn on, tune in, drop out, was popular amongst the emerging hippie class that was growing in the United States, specifically on the West Coast in San Francisco. The bridge of this song, the first bridge, is a very famous passage. In this bridge, George Martin orchestrates a transition from the A section to the B section. And how he does it is he has the orchestra play a 24-measure passage in which the players start on one note, and then they slide on their instruments like a violin, just sliding the finger up the neck. And it sounds shrill, it sounds out of tune, and it sounds absolutely awful if you just listen to it by itself. But the accomplished effect is this crescendo, which provides a certain amount of tension and works really well to bridge the two sections together. Crescendo means starting softer, getting louder. And you'll hear that as they reach the 24th measure, all of a sudden that crescendo goes away and the texture reduces itself to just the piano, the alarm clock, and the drums. And here begins the B section with the ringing of the alarm clock. Woke up, got out of bed, dragged a comb across my head. That's a great lyric with a great rhyme scheme that really illustrates the type of mainstream lifestyle that is common in England and America that's based on routine. The section of the song was written by Paul McCartney and began its life as an independent song, but he never knew what to do with it, and so they decided to use this as the B section for the song. So here we have the A section being by John Lennon and then the B section by Paul McCartney, and you can really tell the difference in the writing and in the overall concept of the way that the sections are put together. The B section concludes with a transition where John Lennon sings on the syllable ah, and he has a melody. And this melody is accompanied by low brass orchestra, and they go into that business of crescendo, starting softer and building and getting louder, getting more intense, and this takes us out of the B section, and so it forms a bridge between B and A. Now, the second A section I call A prime because the lyrics are different. There's a different verse, and the lyrics here are quite absurd, as I've described with some of the other John Lennon lyrics. Here, the lyric is about another newspaper clipping. There were newspaper clipping about the number of potholes in Lancashire and how many of them there are and how much of a problem this is. And then he marries that up with the last line of the song, how many holes it takes to fill the Albert Hall. Okay, so the Albert Hall is the concert hall in London where the London Symphony Orchestra plays. And that visual of how many holes can it take to fill the Albert Hall, like so many Beatles lyrics, there's a lot of read into the metaphor. And, well, he could be comparing orchestra patrons to empty souls. And it may not be exactly what John Lennon meant, but many people spend a lot of time trying to figure this stuff out, and this is one of the theories. The A prime section is musically almost identical to the A section, but listen for the drums. Listen to how Ringo, his drum playing seems more agitated, more active. The outro has the same orchestral setting that Bridge 1 has. But specifically, notice the piano chords at the end. This is accomplished by three players striking the same chord on three different grand pianos. And for those of you who know the piano well, it's a C major chord. C major is a very famous chord for pianists because it consists of only white keys on the piano. And this chord is performed simultaneously by three different pianists. And then they let this chord ring for as long as it does till it dies away, and that's the end of the song. So they strike this chord, and that there's only one chord sounding for, I believe it's 40 seconds, which is an enormous amount of time for a pop tune. Including this chord ending was a very risky, daring kind of thing to do for the Beatles. But of course, as we've learned, this is a period in music where experimentation and getting to that next level of taking popular music into a whole new dimension is exactly what they're trying to do. So in sum, this piano chord at the end, this chord is almost a representation of revolution and the idea of changing what music production and popular music is all about. Okay, so it's time now to give the song a listen. Go to the YouTube channel, or if you have it on your iPod or in your collection, get it out and listen now. And listen a couple of times until you're really familiar with all of these elements that I've illustrated in the podcast. The other revolutionary albums that the Beatles produced in their last period consist of 1967 Magical Mystery Tour, 1968 Abbey Road, which is one of the greatest albums, I think, of their productivity, 1969 The Beatles, and then White Album. This is a double album, which features a lot of distinct recording techniques as well. And finally, in 1970, at the breakup of the band, Let It Be. To cover everything that there is to cover about the Beatles would take an entire college course, like so many other topics when we get into history. We can branch off and look deep into the well of the kinds of real specific things that they did with each track, as well as looked at some of the trivial historical elements. But rather, what I'm hoping that we take from studying the Beatles in this class is that their work divides distinctly into three periods. The first being the early period, where they were just learning the craft of performing. Then the experimental period, where they learned to actually create, as the George Martin said, sound pictures. And then the revolutionary period, where they revolutionized their approach to producing music in the studio. Let's make a master list of traits that belong to the revolutionary period. Here are some of the main recording techniques that are used in the revolutionary period. Multi-track recording, as we described, recording multiple instruments at once and then mixing them down into a single track so that you can continue to do this in layer. Vocal double tracking, this is where you record the voice part and then record it again and record it again and record it again. John Lennon hated this, but they did it anyway. Layering the texture, this is having the bass and then the highest pitches being very clearly stratified. So there's always high pitch, middle pitch, and low pitch. Backward masking, this is actually using recordings that are played backwards and recorded forwards, and then played backwards and mixed down on a track so that you get the backward effect. Sound effects, electronically generated from synthesizers. Atmospheric effects, this would be anything from nature. Field recording and stock sound effects. Recording industry was keeping stock footage, stock recordings on available that were cataloged, that you could pull out. Field recording is simply taking a microphone out into the world and recording sounds that you hear, very similar to what I call atmospheric recording. In terms of instrumentation, they used just about everything you can imagine, but they paired it all up with the standard rock band. And A Day in the Life is a really good example of how they were able to sort of thread in these other instruments or orchestra in such a way that it complements the rock band. So yeah, string instruments, the sitar, obviously, and sound effects. When it comes to song structures in this period in music, anything goes. Typically, you'll have components that we recognize, verses and choruses, and bridges, guitar solos, etc. But you also feature what's called a through composed song, where it's constantly changing from the beginning to the end. Concept albums and medleys of songs. This is to say that all the songs on the record are related somehow, or medleys of songs. For instance, the second side of Abbey Road features this long medley of tunes, taking up the entire second half of the album. The songs could be long, they could be short, they could be abstract, as in the White Album, Beatles Revolution 9, which is a very, very abstract sound picture. And the outro, Hey Jude, has a long, long outro that it repeats over and over again and builds as it goes. And you can listen to these examples, just simply search for them on YouTube. When it comes to rhythm, the backbeat rhythm in their music is almost always easily recognizable. However, they might use changing meters. For instance, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds changes between 3 and 4. There could be tempo changes, slowing down, speeding up, and no one can forget the use of Paul McCartney's piano chords. I talked about how he just simply pulses the chord on the piano. When it comes to lyrics, Paul McCartney wrote love songs, and John Lennon wrote songs that are deeply spiritual or just simply absurd and humorous, to brilliant social commentary. I really think that their approach to lyrics is quite dramatic and quite brilliant. And just listen to this lyric: "She came in through the bathroom window, protected by her silver spoon." That's a radically metaphorical lyric, protected by her silver spoon. Here's a girl who comes from a wealthy background. Or you could look at this another way, that the silver spoon is a drug reference. 4,000 holes in Blackburn, Lancashire. They had to count them all. Now we know how many holes it takes to fill the Albert Hall. This is a really absurd lyric. But it makes a very good point that he's saying that suggesting that sometimes as human beings we tend to do the absurd for no reason at all. Some identify the last album, Let It Be, and the Beatles album, the White Album as it's so called, as late revolutionary, because so much what they do is turning back to the original rock and roll structure, simple songs. But they're not so simple. They carry an element of the revolutionary techniques as well as the experimental techniques. And Dig-a-Pony is a really good example of this. It's quite psychedelic blues, but you can hear that this directly correlates to the Muddy Waters examples. As things went along, Lennon and McCartney continued to go different ways with what they were trying to accomplish as musicians. And Let It Be probably wouldn't have gotten produced had McCartney not taken it to Phil Spector, who did the production work on it. And that was something that was a major sore spot between Lennon and McCartney. And probably one of the reasons why they never performed together again, or write any songs for that matter. In this presentation, I have left out a lot of the trivial details when it comes to the history of this band, because the book does a much better job in expediting some of that information. For example, John Lennon's stunt, the bet-in that he committed with Yoko Ono, his new wife at the time. The infamous Paul is dead scare. The comparison of the Beatles to Jesus. That information is incredibly relevant, but what I hope we learn from this experience is perhaps how to listen to their music and the context that the three periods in their creative production provides us in understanding how the band worked together throughout the decade that they reigned as the Fab Four.